is a big day, shall I say, for China-Japan relations. 4.5 years for the two foreign ministers to meet, particularly here in Beijing, is a rare thing. Not to mention the top leaders of the two countries. First of all, Professor Jimbo, Japan talking about a relationship with China, quote unquote, in a new era. Exactly how would you characterize this new era?
Well, Foreign Minister Kishida had a lecture a couple of days ago in Tokyo and specifically focused on the Japan-China relationship. In there, he actually characterized China as a strategic partner and then need to have a win-win relationship after all. So we perceive China as a great power right now, and in between Japan and China, that is a relation between major powers. This is something like a new characterization of how we see the two bilateral relationships.
Is that wishful thinking or only rhetorical?
Well, I think it is a reality. China has surpassed the GDP of Japan in 2010, and it has become a rival. At the same time, it is a strategic partner after all.
All right. Professor Watanabe, I know sometimes we have different views from Japanese panelists. What about you? Is it realistic that the Japanese foreign minister coming to China this time, despite all of these disputes about history, about territorial disputes, and about how the two countries will find their strategic positions in Northeast Asia, be able to achieve this rosy picture?
The public opinion of Japanese people is very important in the connection of the visit of Mr. Kishida. Public opinion of Japan, especially women with young children, the supporting rate for Prime Minister Abe's cabinet is getting lower and lower. So something should be taken by the government, and one of them is the Mr. Kishida's government visit to China. In addition, we had recently very, very serious big earthquake in Kyushu Island. So these things put the some movement toward the Abe's administration, including Kishida's visit.
I see. Domestic politics, of course, play a very important role these days in any country's international affairs. But Mr. Yang, according to an editorial coming from China's official Xinhua news agency, it said, and I was reading it before coming into the studio, interesting quote, the ball is in the court of Japan. Do you think that is the case, what Japan needs to do so that China could feel the other side is sincere? And what Professor Jimbo just mentioned just now, the beautiful goals set forward by the foreign minister, at least in the public speech, can be achieved, Mr. Yang?
Yeah, actually, the quotation you mentioned means the four basic documents in the bilateral relation remain unchanged.
Okay, let's go to the history. 4 basic documents, what are they?
Well, from 1972, that is the first documents which China-Japan joint declaration that set up the base for the normalization. That is the most important thing, in which there's an article by saying Japan recognize and commit to abide by the Potsdam Declaration, especially the Article 8, something like that.
What does that mean?
That means Japan accepts the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration, returning Taiwan and all the related territory taken by Japan during the war time, return to China. And that also means the right acknowledge about history.
Right.
And because that is that's the base for the world order.
Okay.
So, and the following the three documents illustrate the base and the guidelines for the win-win bilateral relation between the two great countries.
So what are the crucial points that the Chinese side seem to be demanding or observing, if I could use another word?
Well, basically, let me say, shortly speaking, three problems now in bilateral relation.
Go
Two
ahead.
old, one new. Two old is a historical issue, everyone knows. And the second old one issue is the disputes on Diaoyu Islands. But on historical issue, as I mentioned, the first document has set up the base, say declaration, and Diaoyuan disputes. Zhou Enlai and the then Prime Minister, Tian Zhong, I cannot pronounce anyway, the then politicians were very smart.
Okay.
They arranged the side disputes and seal or freeze this issue.
You said 2 olds and 1 new. What is the new one?
New one is the recent constant efforts by Japanese Abe administration in South China Sea. It seems to China that Japan is trying to forge a so-called united front against China from the East Sea to South Sea, although both of the issues from the two seas are totally different.
Okay, now let's go to you, Professor Jimbo. You need to respond to this. Revisionism, that is the thing. Let's start from there. Of the history book, of the basic constitution, which has been Pacific, and now it is much more non-Pacific. So is Japan going to fulfill China's expression in this regard?
Well, I think if you look at track records of the Abe administration, Prime Minister Abe has been quite patient, moderate, and taking pragmatic steps towards those nationalism and historical issues. And as you look at the 4 points agreement we made in November 2014, we actually had reached the agreement over how you can understand and interpret the issue over the East China Sea. And if you look at the 70th anniversary statement, Abe actually didn't go in line with the nationalistic footsteps to reflect his own view on the statement, but it is more like a consensus view to be reflected. And then finally comes to our relation with Korea. In December last year, we finally made a solution on the Code for Women issue. By and large, this is a very pragmatic steps, and which makes the impression that the Abe administration is taking very seriously about the relation with neighbors.
All right, we want to hear different voices. Professor Watanabe, what about the history issue? Is Abe administration following rather a peaceful way or rather an irritating way to its neighbors?
Historical issues, especially symbolized by the Yasukuni Shrine, where the war criminals are enshrined, these things could be utilized by the Abe administration and also supporters of the LDP conservative side. And when the cabinet is put into endangered position, they want to use that kind of the symbol to get the more support from the people, or they want to make the eyes of the people towards something diplomatic with the foreign countries. This time, China is very important because former Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda suggested to the people through the media that China should be one of the members of the G7. G7 meeting will be organized in May in Japan. And also Mr. Fukuda suggested that in the coming May summit, the issue whether or not we should welcome China as the member of G7 should be discussed. This political process is changing the environment of the politics.
Okay. First of all, history, very briefly coming from you, Mr. Yang. Of course, revision, as I mentioned, the textbooks and the constitution changes as well. These are all big topics here in China. Can Chinese diplomat like Mr. Wang Yi, together with his Japanese counterparts, be able to overcome this kind of public sentiment and overcome, in a way, what history has already agreed, and therefore ignore these historical issues and move forward? Can that be possible? And should that be possible?
Well, no way to overcome such a complicated and long time problems laying in the bilateral relation. But anyway, the bilateral foreign minister meeting will at least create a better atmosphere.
Well, I want you to hold here, Mr. Yang, because we all remember last November, back in the year 2014, when Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Abe, during the APEC summit. Of course, it was a trilateral or multilateral platform, but still they shook hands, and everyone saw it. People expect things to get better. However, it did not. It probably even get worse given all the circumstances. So, Mr. Yang, is it practical that we are expecting another top official meeting to make things happen?
Well, that's why you mentioned the quotation said no. Now the ball is at the Japanese court, simply because besides the two old issues, the one new issue, why the shape of the bilateral relation is getting worse after the top leaders meeting. That could be better, but why worse? Because a new issue, new problem emerged. So I think if Japan regard China, the key question is how Japan regard China.
That's very interesting. Let me come back to you, Mr. Kimbo, earlier talking about that Japan look at China as a strategic partner, but then it seems that nothing is suggesting that about happening. It sounds like strategic opposition.
Well, I would rather say optimistic view on this regard, because Japan and China has immediate need for cooperation on various fields. Take example about the North Korean issues. After the missile launch and the nuclear test, we negotiated very deeply at the UN Security Council and came up with the security resolution. And we need to step up and follow up how to implement that on that issue. And then come back to the G7, G20. We're holding G7. We need to coordinate the stance on that. G20, we're visiting China, and we expect to have a summit meeting once again. So there are various types of strategic and also a more technical bureaucratic issue that we can both have to negotiate on that issue. So this is why practically we need to come to China, have a face-to-face meeting, and then come up with a solution.